Hi, this video is an overview of using Regressor. Regressor is a control and modulation system for Ableton that uses the power of machine learning to create complex maps between any type and any number of input control signals to control and modulate any type and any number of destinations inside Ableton. So to start off the demo, I've got a wavetable synth that's playing some arpeggiated chords, and I added a regressor to this track. And I'm going to use Regressor to control 5 different parameters in this synth, each of which creates a pretty obvious change in sound. So I'll just use the 5 I just touched there. Regressor is organized into 2 basic sections. You've got your inputs and training controls on the left, and you've got your outputs and mapping on the right. So I'm going to set the number of outputs to 5, and that opens up the mapping panel, which you can also open and close with this button. And then we just map the outputs of Regressor onto the destinations we want to use in Ableton. This is the same system you would use with Ableton's LFO or envelope follower, if you're familiar with those things. You could be mapping onto anything in Ableton, like the volume of this track over here. And when we map Regressor onto those things, these sliders now control the destinations inside Ableton. But I'm actually just going to map onto the 5 parts of my synth that I identified. So these sliders now control those 5 wavetable parameters, and you can change the range of the output over here. So I don't want my release to go all the way that high. I'll just bring down the maximum to like 50%. And similarly, I'll bring down this detune parameter. Yeah, okay. So now we've got everything mapped, and we can train the neural network. The basic idea with training a neural network is that you're giving it examples of an input that's associated with an output. And after you've given it enough examples, the neural network can make predictions about new conditions. You can give it like inputs it's never seen before, and it'll predict what the right kind of output should be. So we'll start off real simple. I'll just make a kind of clean sound. This is going to be my output. And then I'll choose an input to control this. I'm going to use the built-in XY pad on Regressor. You can also use OSC or MIDI controls as inputs. But the XY pad is a nice way to experiment. So I'm going to move the XY pad to the top left corner, and I'm going to click on Add Points. I've got 1 point added to my data set now, where it now knows that this input should be associated with these outputs over here. And then I'll go down and I'll give it a new input, the lower left, and I'll make a sound to associate with this. So once I've got the input and the output how I want them, I'll click Add Points again. Now I've got 2 points in my data set, and that's enough to give it a go. I'll exit training mode by unclicking this button, and I can move back to my clean sound and down into this other sound. Okay, so let's give it some more examples. I'll go back into training mode, and I'm going to come up with a sound to put in the top right part of the XY space here. And this time I'm going to click on Randomize Output, which just generates random values for the outputs. And I like doing this as a way to find unexpected states. And I'll just kind of fine tune it to my liking. And I'll click add points. Now I've got something there. And for the lower right, I'll do this again. That's pretty cool. And now I've got 4 points in my data set. I can exit training mode, and now I can move around inside this two-dimensional space where we're morphing in between these 4 different sounds we made. And we can give it as many examples as we want. I could put something in the middle of this space. Make a big detuned sound. Put that right there. So now we have this like very non-linear way to morph between all these different sounds, but these are all sounds that we designed or discovered that we think work well. And so that's the basic idea of regression, is giving a neural network this training data with inputs and outputs, and then once it has enough of them, it can make these predictions using inputs it's never seen before. Like, we didn't train it on anything around here, but it's sort of like learned how to move between these spaces. A couple other ways you can play with the output of Regressor. There is a drift function. So if I bring up the drift amount, my outputs are just kind of wiggling around the predicted output. You can change the speed of that. So this can be a nice way to just create some constant motion in your sound, even if your input isn't moving. There's also a slew control here if you want to smooth out the outputs. I find that to be pretty useful for things like body tracking. For MIDI, I'm going to just take that out. If we want to control this XY space without using our mouse for everything, we could just map some MIDI controllers onto the X and Y position. And this will make it into a sort of instrument where we can explore the Y space and the X space. Or another thing I like to do is just add a good old-fashioned LFO. We'll make this a slow LFO, and I'll map this onto the X. And change the rate for this one, map this onto the Y. And now we can just let the LFOs drive our position inside this two-dimensional sound space that we've designed. And we could add a little bit of drift to that. So we'll get some randomization on top of this kind of automatic exploration. Okay, so that's an example using the built-in two-dimensional controller in Regressor. Okay, on our next track, I've got a drum loop, and I made an effects rack that has roar and a beat repeat inside of it. And on my effects rack, I've set up some macro knobs to control the amount of distortion, distortion bias, distortion filter, and feedback. Let's play the beat so you can hear that stuff. And I've also got beat repeat where I can bring up the chance of the beat repeats happening, the grid of the repeats, and this pitch shifter. Okay, so we've got 7 different knobs to play with, and I'll add a regressor onto this track. And for this one, I'm going to be using the MIDI inputs. You can use up to 8 MIDI sources, but I'm actually going to use just one. And I'm going to map one slider from my MIDI controller onto this one knob. And I'm going to use this one slider to drive all 7 of my macro knobs. So I'm going to set my output size to 7 and just map all of my outputs onto my macro knobs. Okay, and now we're going to train the neural network. So again, we're going to give it examples of inputs and outputs, and I'll start with this relatively clean sound at the bottom of my slider, and I'll add that as a point. Then I'll go quarter of the way up, and yeah, I'll use that. Halfway up. Yeah, all right, let's do that one. Great. And then at the top, let's get something really glitchy. Great. Okay, and then we'll exit training mode. Okay, that's super fun. So I've got, like, as I go from the bottom of my slider to the top, each of these outputs has this like completely different curve that it's following. And we're morphing in between all these like really cool effect states that we established when we trained it. All right, and on my third track, I've got a bass line. I've got this drift synth where, again, I've set up an effects rack with some macros that control the oscillators, the noise, the filter, both filters, and the detuner on the synth. And then I've also set up an auto pan here where I can control the amount and the rate of the auto panning. Let's play the bass line. Okay, and I'm going to control this using some body tracking data. So this regressor I'm going to put into OSC for the input, and I've got a Touch Designer project here set up that's using Google's Media Pipe to do different kinds of body tracking. We could use face tracking, height, or you could use whole body tracking if you want to use your whole body. I'm going to use hand tracking, and I've set this up so that it's using just one hand. So my Touch Designer project is sending the body tracking data on port 7000. If I click on print sensors, we should see all of the body tracking data coming in. Okay. So the OSC data usually has an address at the front of it that'll say something like /address. In this case, it says /hands. Let me close this window. And in Regressor, I'm going to say, show me all of the data coming in on this address called hands. And there we can see the X coordinates of this hand, the Y coordinates, and the Z coordinates for forwards, backwards. All right, so my effects rack has 10 outputs. So I'm going to set up Regressor with 10 outputs and map these. Okay. All right, so now Regressor is controlling all 10 macro knobs. Maybe I'll bring down the range of that one. I'll bring down that one. All right. Cool. So now we're going to train the neural network to learn the relationship between this very complex input signal, my body tracking data, where we've got this long list of floating point numbers that represent where my hand is in space, and we're going to map it onto these 10 outputs. So as you can see, when I move my hand left and right and up and down, those numbers are shifting around. So you could set this up to just like use the place of your hand, or you could also teach it to learn sort of like poses. So I think I'm going to focus on making it learn the poses and try to have it ignore the position of my hand. So to do this, I'm going to give it a pose that I want to use and click on Add Points. When we do this in OSC mode, the Add Points button turns into a toggle, and it's going to be continuously adding points as it receives new OSC messages. So as soon as I open up this toggle, I'm going to give it many different examples of the pose that I want it to learn. So here we go. All right, so we've got 134 points, and they're associated with this pose. And now I'll make a sound that goes with this pose. Yeah, like that. We'll add these points. And I'll give it a pose where my hand is half open. Yeah, all right. And then I'll give it one where my hand is reversed. Sure. Okay. And now I'll exit training mode. We've got 564 points in our training data, so this is going to take a minute for it to learn the relationship between all these. All right, and now we're mapped. So we've got our open hand sound, our closed hand sound, half open, and we can use our hand to move around between all these outputs. Okay, what else do I want to show you? If at some point you want to reset your learning data, you can click reset and it'll ask you if you definitely want to erase all the learning you've done. I'll say cancel, but that's how you would do that. You can save out your training data as a JSON file. which you don't need to do. Regressor stores the training inside the Ableton session, and when you reopen it, it'll be ready to be used. But saving out your file can be a good way to test different mapping conditions. And with something that's a little more complex like body tracking data, that can be nice to do. And then you can use the read button to read back in any JSON files that you've saved. So far, everything I've shown you is the approach you would use if you were going to be using this in a performance type situation. But these three buttons give you some options for how to record the outputs into automation lines if you wanted to refine them in a studio situation. So if we were putting this down as a track, we can do all our sound design stuff. But if you wanted to capture this, capture the outputs into automation lanes, you can edit. You can do this by going into record mode. There we go. So now you can see the 10 outputs on my bass synth are all getting recorded into automation lanes. And then one thing to be cautious about is that this is going to flood your undo history when you're recording these things as automation outputs, because it's like as if you were recording MIDI data. So if we want to now switch back and just use these automation lanes to drive the outputs of Regressor, we go into playback mode, and you can see our macro knobs are all following these lanes. And if you wanted to edit this automation, like I'll just max out this first knob after bar 20. You can, you can edit these things in whatever way makes sense for your piece. But in a live performance situation, I would just keep this in live mode. And when we do it that way, the input signal is always controlling the output signals, whereas in playback mode, the input no longer is doing anything to the outputs. All right, the final thing I haven't shown you is this does have the ability to send out these outputs over OSC as well. So you turn that on and off with this button, and when you turn it on, you can choose whatever address and port number you want to use for outgoing OSC messages. So you could send these outputs to, if you use a different application for visuals like Touch Designer, you could send them to Touch Designer that way, or you could send them to a different computer on your network by changing the IP address to the IP address of that other machine. Okay, so that is the overview. I hope you have fun exploring neural networks and coming up with unexpected gestural sound design using this new tool. Thanks.